welcome to the second day of the 2024 Triple Canopy Symposium.
My name is Rachel Ossip, and I am the deputy editor at Triple Canopy. Thanks again for being here on this beautiful, if chilly, Saturday, and also thanks everyone who's tuning in on the live stream. If anyone's unfamiliar, Triple Canopy is a digital magazine that works with contributors in a wide range of disciplines and media, everything from text and experimental web-based artist projects to lectures, screenings, conversations, and performances. While the bulk of our work exists online, we also organize public programs at our venue on Canal Street and at partner organizations around New York City and beyond. And on that note, we're so excited to be here at Roulette and to have worked with them to produce this year's program. If you'd like to learn more about Triple Canopy, you can check out our website, the charmingly repetitive canopy.com. One of Triple Canopy's major aims is not simply to comment on culture, but to collaborate closely with artists and writers to produce it. In that vein, we've been working to break down the line between cultural criticism and cultural production, highlighting artists and writers as critics and emphasizing critics' roles as producers of culture in their own right. The symposium is our annual in-person, real-time instantiation of this ambition. We're very grateful for our partnership with Critical Minded, an initiative that supports cultural critics of color on this year's symposium. Triple Canopy is a nonprofit organization, and almost everything that we do is, like all of the programs this weekend, completely free to attend or experience. But, of course, they are not free to organize. Everyone presenting and assisting us this weekend has been paid fairly, and we rely on the generosity of our supporters for that to happen. Even small amounts help, and friend memberships begin at only $36 a year. If you'd like to support Triple Canopy so we can, in turn, support artists, writers, designers, academics, actors, musicians, and more to do this kind of work, please come up to me or my colleagues at the Triple Canopy table in the lobby. Okay, now I get to turn to the true event at hand, the illustrious guests sitting beside me, Kate Crawford and Hari Kunzru, who are here to discuss a topic that has been occupying so much airtime in intellectual and artistic conversations of this decade so far: artificial intelligence, and more specifically, generative AI, and its changing understanding of what it means to create something today. There's a huge amount of excitement and anxiety around these technologies, which can and have already altered, for instance, how people write emails and produce illustrations, what kind of images populate social media, and how educational establishments evaluate student knowledge, how we all do our work. Generative AI has also extensively shaken copyright law, and we're going to spend some time, guided by a recent paper Kate co-authored, digging into that, though I promise our conversation will stretch far beyond surface debates about the use of artists' images and training data. Before I get in too deep, though, let me formally introduce our guests. I can really think of no pair I'd be more excited to discuss these issues with. Kate Crawford is an internationally leading scholar of artificial intelligence and its impacts, and the author of the very first book I recommend to anyone who wants to dig deeper into AI, Atlas of AI, Power, Politics, and the Planetary Costs of Artificial Intelligence. Alongside her many, many accomplishments and appointments as a scholar and writer, Kate also works visually and has created art installations and visual investigations, including the project Anatomy of an AI System with Vladan Joler, am I saying that correctly? Which is currently on view at MoMA, and their latest work, Calculating Empires, A Genealogy of Technology and Power, which we'll look at a little bit later, which won the grand prize of the European Commission for Art and Technology. Hari Kunzru is an acclaimed author whose novels, most recently Blue Ruin, often dig at the complexities of creative practice across fields, posing questions about participation and complicity, the origins and conditions for what one might call creativity, the pressures of the market, surveillance, and much more. He's also a sharply observant critic and journalist whose work has appeared in basically every major publication and ranges from book reviews to deep dives on internet subcultures and beyond. His novels have been translated into 21 languages, though that figure may be now out of date, and he is the recipient of fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation, the New York Public Library, and the American Academy in Berlin. So I'm going to jump in with some questions for Hari and Kate to get the conversation going, and we'll talk for about 40 minutes before segueing into taking audience questions. This discussion isn't the first time Hari and Kate will be talking about these topics, though. Instead, today we'll be surfacing the tip of a much larger iceberg. You two have been having conversations about these tools and their impacts for some time now, gathering groups of lawyers and engineers as well as other artists as informal research groups. Would you kick things off by telling us a little bit more about how you two started talking and how those conversations developed?
Sure. I mean, well, we were introduced by a mutual friend, the artist Trevor Paglin, and as the sort of generative AI started to loom, I suppose that's probably the best way of putting it, I realized I desperately wanted to kind of get a handle on it and to kind of understand how I might perhaps use these tools or engage with it in some sort of meaningful way. And so I called Kate and suggested, and I sort of asked to pick your brains basically. And what we came up with was this idea of, I mean, it's a slightly pretentious word, the salon, but basically a kind of just basically people turning up to her house or my house, and small groups of people speaking in private and just letting each other know what they were doing, what they were finding out. And we found those conversations, which have been going on for, we think, 2 years now, right, have been incredibly rich because they have brought people together from very different fields. You mentioned lawyers and engineers, but also people working in various kinds of visual and linguistic creative fields. We swore we wouldn't say the word creative without interrogating it immediately. But yeah, I mean that's the context in which we've been having these conversations, and so this is the first time I think we've done a public event, possibly.
I think it is.
Yeah.
I actually remember what was really sort of got my attention was when Hari reached out and said, I'm pretty sure generative AI is going to eat my lunch. And I thought, of all of the people who would be worried about generative AI, I didn't think it would be you. I was like, this is someone whose books have always felt so far ahead that there was no way that ChatGPT was going to create a Hari Kunzru novel. But it was very clear that there was a real anxiety, and that anxiety, I think, has really just grown in that period over the last 2 years. So this group has been in somewhere between kind of a group of people who can say, what's going on, what are you seeing, because it's changing so quickly, and also partly like an emotional support group where we can sort of sit around and go, what the hell is happening next? And it's been really lovely. It's been a sort of intergenerational collection of great individuals like Lynn Hirschman-Leeson, Simon Denny, Ted Chang, Laurie Anderson. Like it's a combination of visual artists, sound artists, but also academics who write about art and copyright, like Amy Adler. And so we really get in there.
A whole table full of lawyers at my house at the last time, didn't we?
Yeah, that tells you something, right? Anyway, so we kind of thought it would be nice to share some of that thinking with you and to see where you're going with some of these questions as well, because since we started, I think the last 2 years have been an extraordinary inflection point in this field, and we are now all implicated in multiple ways as to how this plays out. So yes, I think it's a good time to make that conversation public.
Great. And just to put a fine point, I think most of what we're talking about is generative AI, which is tools and models like DALL-E, ChatGPT, GTP4, Midjourney, all of these kinds of things. Is there anything further you'd like to say to clarify? I feel like it's useful just to bring that up because AI can mean so many different things today.
Well, I hate the definition of artificial intelligence generally. I think it's possibly one of the biggest misnomers that we have to contend with. John McCarthy, actually, who was one of the people who's responsible for this sort of terrible name, later in the 1970s said that it was an error, it was a mistake to call things artificial intelligence because it puts you on absolutely the wrong path of understanding what they're doing, which in his view was statistical analysis at scale, which is much less sexy as a term, but much more accurate. And it takes us away from all of this sort of fixation on, the great intelligence behind these systems. It takes us away from the anthropomorphization that we find so frustrating. And I think it also does something else, which is that I would like to say when we talk about AI, that we don't just focus on the algorithmic layer or the interface layer, but we talk about the massive, now $1 trillion infrastructure that back-ends it and that makes it possible at planetary scale with enormous environmental cost. So for me, when we talk about AI, you have to talk about infrastructure and political economy at the very start, or you're missing the story.
Beautiful. Yeah, I feel like there's a lot of really entertaining, if not actualized, alternative names for AI. One of my favorite is the linguist Emily Bender suggests that we call it systematic approaches to learning algorithms and machine inferences, or salami, and that it would change a lot if what these conversations were about was how salami is going to change our lives. Though that doesn't take in the material layer, as you were noting. Yeah, I think one of the occasions for this discussion also was this paper that you recently co-authored that is really specifically about this consideration of the way that copyright law not only structures creative practice, but how AI is kind of destabilizing that at the root in some ways. And that starts a lot with a conversation of authorship. But I think it also came out of this conversation with Hari about a notion of style, and how when generative AI is copying work, it's not usually copying an exact instance. It's copying a pattern, or whether it's content plus composition and rhythm and things like this that is a signature of an artist's work. So Hari, I wonder if you want to jump in and say a little bit more about your thinking there.
Well, I mean, copyright as a frame for this is immediately sends us into a kind of terrible problem, because you have the famous distinction between the idea, which under copyright theories of copyright is usually considered to be part of the commons, has to be freely circulatable, if that's a word, and the individual expression of an idea, which is a material and determinate thing, which is something that could potentially be copyrighted. And in between that, we have this idea of style. We recognize it when we see it. I mean, obviously, style has a very complicated kind of cluster of meanings, but when we ask a model to make us a picture of a cat, we can specify stylistic ways, whether it's the medium that we want it to mimic, or even, obviously we have the issues around in the style of living artist X, and that precisely escapes the frame in which traditional copyright has operated. And then, so it's immediately slippery, and immediately kind of takes us to a place of nervousness as people who are attempting to perhaps sustain ourselves through creative work, and then puts us into this strange kind of sort of epistemic crisis where we have to try and do this work of classification between what is original creativity and what is copying, and so on. And this is precisely what gets troubled by models that have been trained on large corpuses of data.
I feel like when we were chatting a little bit downstairs, we said we really want to kind of cut through a lot and get to the heart of the matter. And one of the things that came up was, and I'm curious, Kate, because this paper ends in what could be, I don't know if ambivalent is quite the right word here, but on a statement about the relationship between copyright and its protection of property, right, versus a protection of livelihood. And I want to make sure that we're clear about we're not necessarily up here arguing in favor of copyright, right? And I wonder if you'd like to say a little bit more about that and kind of parse a little bit why is it useful to use copyright as a frame for this kind of conversation?
Right. I mean, it's super interesting because, of course, we're living in the moment of, I think, one of the biggest land grabs by a sector, certainly in our lifetimes. And I think we've heard tech tech leaders describe the internet as freeware, and this is like deeply troubling to many of us. But on the other hand, is trying to say copyright will save the day, and make sure that intellectual property can reassert the right of the owner. And I think this is also a trap, the idea that copyright can actually solve this. And it's interesting, if you go all the way back to the first emergence of copyright law, Statute of Anne 1710, and even then it was a fight between owners of the means of production and artists. So, at that time it was the printers who had the right to print books, and they could decide to just edit the book and just censor out bits that they didn't like. And so, of course, this produces an enormous fight that produces the Statute of Anne. So it focuses on the idea of artists having an incentive to produce, right? So we are basically giving you a limited term monopoly to produce a particular type of work. But while that sounds great, if you actually do an analysis of contemporary copyright and you see who holds it, who is actually making the most money out of copyright works, it is, of course, publishing companies in their various forms. So ultimately, it has always been about a very small number of owners who are benefiting from IP law rather than artists writ large. So one of the things that I'm really hoping that we can do, and sort of cutting through the endless numbers of panels around AI and creativity and copyright law, is to say, why do we assume that copyright is the vessel through which we should be prosecuting this question around fairness and livelihood and labour, rather than a much bigger set of questions? Because I think in so many ways, copyright has not been a friend to the artists and writers who've been having these sorts of issues around the abrogation of their work for centuries. So I think we're facing a moment now where copyright law itself is in real trouble. I mean, we've just seen the US Copyright Office open up for comment to the public. They got 17,000 submissions at the end of last year. We're waiting. It could be days away that we're going to get the report from them saying, do we need to reconceptualize copyright law? That's a big change. That's a very big moment. And so what I'm really interested in is how do we talk more about ownership in a more profound way that doesn't just say, okay, how do we reassert the rights of ownership to work?
And I think one of the things that's been distressing to me watching all of these conversations play out is it does seem to align artists with copyright as though it's an inherent good that is supporting their practice, when historically it has been exploitative of artists in a similar way as well. And but Hari, you seem like you're ready to jump in there.
I mean, I think taking a step sort of backwards from that, I mean, underlying this is this massive epistemic anxiety about personhood and about a kind of residual wish to have some sort of bright line between what we understand as human, with all the kind of values that we attach to that, and non-human. I mean, it's a funny thing that kind of after a sort of generation of conversations about the post-human, or kind of the limits of humanism as a sort of system of values, and so a lot of people have found themselves suddenly making all these very conservative arguments about the human. I mean, we all made faces about creativity as a term, and the reason that seems problematic is that it is a kind of sort of secularized religious notion of creation out of nothing, about origination, and it is it's a kind of organicist idea, and in many ways, I imagine many people in this room would have serious problems with that sort of warmed over romanticism as a kind of basis for understanding anybody's creative practice. We're obviously embedded in social matrices, all sorts of reasons that the creative, originating individual kind of channeling the divine spark is not actually how we think about the work, but then you're being asked to kind of find a way to protect your ability to eat. So that's an interesting tension to me, and I think we need what you in the agreement said. We need a post-human account of creative labour, and I think it is. We should. It gets a little clearer for me when we do talk in terms of political economy and in terms of labour. in order to kind of understand what that question is and to separate it out from all this very sort of particularly sort of soupy set of ideas that turn up when we start thinking about artificial intelligence and intelligence as a cipher for personhood and for moral consequence and all the other things that we associate with that.
Right. But I want to push you on this, Hari, because I think it's coming. It's coming. So, I mean, this idea of how do we think about post-human creativity, right? And there's another tension here, because on one side, I think there's something really exciting that's happening at the moment, and on the other side, there's something that's incredibly problematic. And I think we need to call them out early so that we are all talking about the same thing. So, at the moment, in fact, literally just this week, there is a new lawsuit which has emerged out of a group of musicians who were in a forest in Ecuador, and they decided to list the forest as a co-composer of this piece because they were, including forest sounds, and they're like, this is clear that the forest should be as much of a creative producer of this song as we are. And, you might just say, well, that's cute, but it's never going to work because copyright law has been very clear, and we might remember the monkey selfie case where a photographer gave a monkey a camera, the monkey took a photo, it won a series of awards, but the monkey was denied copyright because it was not human and therefore doesn't respond to incentives. But now in Ecuador, there's something really exciting happen because, as some of you know, Ecuador was the country that said that the forest has a constitutional right to exist. So the forest is seen as an entity in itself. And so this case is actually really kind of a type of legal activism to say, what if a forest has a constitutional right to exist, does it also have moral authorship in relation to copyright law? So we're expanding the right of a non-human entity. Now that to me is exciting and interesting, and we get somewhere kind of like really challenging to traditional ideas of copyright law. On the other side, you have people in Silicon Valley saying, generative AI is clearly an entity and it should have its own copyright inherent in everything that's produced by, say, DALL-E or GPT-3. Now, I know that you and I would very strongly dispute that. So now we've got a different tension, like how we're defining the post-human here gets a little bit gnarly.
Yeah, so I then have to ask, what's the incentive for the forest to have its rights protected, and maybe, continued existence or something is part of that. But a lot of the conversation, as I understand it, around AI and personhood and agency or so on, turns on this notion of valency, like, beings have, if it can experience one thing as pleasurable or positive or desirable, and another thing as not. And I come back to the, is a zero sadder than a one? In some way, because a lot of the ways I've heard, especially engineering people talk around this, who seem to be essentially attracted to the notion of non-human entities, or kind of who like, maybe you're deeply into computational theory of mind and you like the idea of the mind as something which is independent of a particular biological substrate, so there's no reason that a mind that's instantiated in silicon or whatever shouldn't have the same kind of consequence as another kind of mind. But it does, you've got the idea of incentives, and you've got the idea of in some way of pleasure and pain, and the kind of moral obligations that one has towards beings that can experience those things. And and I think that none of those things, both of those take us beyond the human as kind of traditionally understood, man as the measure of all things and the end of all things. But we certainly, and I think, but it does give us ways of distinguishing potentially between certain, between kind of the experience of valency of some kind and not. I don't know where I've landed with that, but that's some words I said.
Yeah, this is also when it gets interesting, right? Because if we take it back into the frame of copyright, we're in this profoundly weird moment. It is the most radical moment in the history of copyright, which is that we have systems that are producing billions of works every day that live entirely outside of an ownership model. And it doesn't matter if that's a ChatGPT novel or if it's a Disney, designer sitting there trying to think about a new character. That if you've produced it in any generative AI tool, that is now not owned. It is in the commons. You can do whatever you want with it. So that is a profound moment, and I'm just waiting for that to shift, because we've got so many companies lining up to say, no, we want to be able to own these images that we're producing. There was even a court case recently where somebody argued that they used over 600 prompts and changed what was being produced so profoundly that they should have a copyright interest in that work. And they were denied. It was still said that the model is doing so much more work than the human, that effectively this is still machine authorship.
I mean, that's a very interesting relationship, isn't it? It's one that you brought up in that essay, is the model versus the prompter.
Right.
And, as the prompters, we exist within a matrix or within a grid that has in some way been prearranged for us, and how much work are we actually doing compared to the I don't know, the labor of training and so on. Am I correct in saying that if you've used Gen AI at any point in your creative process, you are at risk of not being able to assert your rights at the moment? Is that still true?
We are waiting on multiple lawsuits, but if you originate there, then you don't own that work. If you're using it in a pipeline, you've probably got stronger grounds, but it's still not clear. That's what's so interesting about it. We have this radical uncertainty right now about how any of this is going to be decided.
I mean, I'm very interested in the ways that our kind of current notions of art and the art world don't seem to be capturing what's going on creatively, even. I mean, we had there's a sort of grumble about nothing having really happened in contemporary art since post-internet, and that being, 15 years ago. And, is there a crisis in the legacy art system that we've inherited from the sort of 20th century avant-gardes, and which New York is so identified with? Are a lot of people who are doing work that would once, who they think were doing artistic work that are completely outside the system now. And I guess if the majority of work that's being made now falls outside that system of being able to even identify it with a named human originator or creative, then that accelerates something that's felt like a collapse of the art system.
I mean, this is why I love your last book, Blue Ruin, because I think you sort of capture this sort of last gasp of a vision of, the great white male artist as a kind of an idea of this is the source of creativity. And it's so interesting because we're in a moment where a lot of artists I know are now hedged against the gallery system. That the gallery system is seen as itself, in a type of crisis. And we're seeing it here in New York all the time. I mean, there is a moment right now in the art world where people are seeing a huge fracturing into very different camps. And that's actually telling us something about the failure of a particular model, a failure of ability to, again, pay your rent, if we take it back to labor.
We were encouraged, the early 21st century model was the kind of the personal brand for all creators. We all had to be kind of, on the gram all the time, kind of just trying to kind of, attach as much value or make as much value flow through our personae as possible. And, look where all that sharing has got us. It just got kind of enclosed and taken away from us by Silicon Valley, and now, so yeah, I mean, after that, I would be less interested in having my name on the front of my books if that wasn't a kind of necessary precondition for me being able to make the work. I would probably engage in much more collaboration and engage in, I don't know, things like kind of collective names, Luther Blissett and all those kind of projects, and the break on doing that kind of work is absolutely to do with the way that compensation is organised. And so, this in this crisis, maybe there's an opportunity, maybe there's a kind of there's a way for us to read, to think beyond the brand name artist, who's the ultimate destination for everybody's career, to be on a MoMA tote bag.
I feel like this is a nice moment to bring back when we were emailing, Kate, you wrote about the joke that goes, question, what is the difference between an artist and a filmmaker? Answer, credits. And how if we thought about this in relation to generative AI, the credits would be in the millions, if not billions and trillions, in terms of all of the images that went into the training data, everyone who has materially contributed to the infrastructure, all of the people working on the algorithms, everyone who's done content moderation. And I've really appreciated some work by the literary scholar up at Columbia, Dennis E. Tenen, who's written this book called Literary Theory for Robots. And I feel like a lot of what he's discussing is a continuity between generative AI and things like spell check, the dictionary, thesauri, these other tools that he sees as repositories of collective intelligence and collective, quote-unquote, creativity. And that if we see it in that lineage, it's just a way that we are all always working in multiplicity, even if we have had these great man narratives. And that if once you see generative AI in that lineage, it feels far less terrifying. I think there's a lot of other reasons that it is deeply terrifying, but in terms of thinking of it as like an individual actor, it kind of demystifies that. And I think that the dream, right, is that what if AI ushers in a great era of collectivity, right? But that seems like not the way things are going to go.
Sorry.
I mean, the platform model isn't exactly kind of utopian horizontalism, is it?
No, I mean this is the actual spectre in the room, right? It's not the fact that this is a tool that we can use to produce work, because I'm sure many of us in this room have used it in different ways. It's not that it is a non-human entity and that's what's threatening about it. That is not the issue either. The issue is that there is the most extraordinary concentration of wealth and corporate power behind it. It's one of the most concentrated industries in the world. There are really 3 companies in the West who can produce generative AI at planetary scale, and 2 in China, depending how you count. So you really have to go very far back in history to find a similarly hyper-concentrated industry where wealth and power is accruing to so few billionaires who are already so rich from the last wealth intensification that came from the platform moment. So we are now looking at something that is so profoundly concentrated that to look at that in any way as a sort of pluralization, or even worse, a democratization of creativity, power, production, is to me the greatest myth of all. And unfortunately, many people are falling for it.
So I'm going to add something to that. But yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, what an abused word democracy is, and democratization in this particular sense. I mean, always when I don't know, a working artist goes on Twitter to worry about about the future, somebody else says, well, you're just trying to kind of protect your little patch. You're essentially a hand loom weaver, and you have to just sort of suck it up. And I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think the kind of orientation away from, I mean, this is one of Trevor's things, orientation of image making away from human consumption is a fascinating thing. I mean, we're going to produce huge volumes of text that are not for human consumption. I mean, the kind of automation of law and contract, all that kind of massive corpus of text is going to take place, around us. I mean, it's. I'm just drifting here. Say something else.
All right, you've challenged me. So, I mean, I think this is to take us back to the joke, which I love. The difference between an artist and a filmmaker is credits. Is that if there is something that's happening at the moment, it's the realization that we are living in these profoundly network-based forms of production, and it's time to sort of move away from this idea of like the singular artist who doesn't even mention their collaborators, let alone their studio assistants or anybody else. And I think that model is looking particularly threadbare right now. And the thing that is looking interesting to me is the fact that we're really starting to look behind how these systems are produced. I mean, we're talking about reinforcement learning by human feedback, RLHF workers, in the millions in order to make something like ChatGPT work. I mean, we are talking about an extraordinary expansion of the lowest level of labor exploitation to make these systems work. So how do you start to build that into your understanding of what is this quote-unquote neutral tool that you're using?
And that's precisely what troubles the human-machine distinction, in that these are massive assemblages of human labour and compute, and it's not Terminator in any level.
Yeah, I think that goes back to the ultimate notion of this collective repository, right? And also, I think I've been trying to, you always play with terms, right? And so I've been trying, what if we called it alienated intelligence? Because in fact, it's all of these people, sitting somewhere else and building this for us, right? Or, for anyone who's starting to use it. So I think there's a lot of ways in which these conversations do come down to terminological hair splitting, which at once feels fussy and on the other hand feels absolutely crucial because it ultimately defines how we're talking about these things. I feel like it might be useful to go back for a second and actually hit clearly on the point of machine authorship, because we've been circling around this, but I don't know if everyone here is familiar with that ruling, and it might be clarifying to say a little bit more about that.
Well, I mean, simply put, it's the idea that machines can't be authors because algorithms don't have incentives. So, they operate to optimize a set of functions and they, serve their masters, but this is not seen as a sufficient form of incentive making. And I think that's kind of interesting, right? Because we could start to sort of pull apart, whose incentives are operating where. And every time, of course, we use one of these systems, we are further feeding that machine. We are giving them more data, more information to build better systems. So, I mean, for me, I think, the stuff that gets more interesting is moving away from definitional hair splitting and actually looking at, okay, where are the labor movements around this? Where have we seen the first AI labor strike? And we had an extraordinary example last year. I mean, we saw the writers in Hollywood and the actors get together and in many cases suffer extreme economic consequences, for months on end not working, to say we can see that these contracts are an absolute nightmare for us. And so it's less about this kind of, human versus the machine, but you sort of pull away the scrim and you see it's about humans versus an extremely, currently now, predatory industry. And how are you going to prevent those new contracts being really damaging to the people who are actually making work?
I mean, since we brought up the billionaires, this is our segue into the sphere. Both of us have recently separately been in Las Vegas looking at the sphere, and I was looking at Darren Aronofsky has a film that's showing in the sphere in Las Vegas that is a piece of pure sort of Bezos propaganda about why he shows it. I mean, it seems sort of it's very beautiful and sort of vanilla. Kind of the wonders of the natural world, it's an elephant, here are people in their national costume. But then it flips. It suddenly starts telling you that we've screwed it all up. We've destroyed the world, and the only cure for this is to move the mass of the population off the planet, rewild the planet, and then only the few will be able to use the Earth as a kind of glorified natural park. And it has a. And then you get a lot of imagery of people in sort of white outfits, sort of standing alone on mountaintops or sort of bouldering in Yosemite without anyone else there. And, apart from getting a dig in, all that, I mean, that really, I mean, it's class warfare is what is at work here. And it's not the creative individual versus the faceless machine. There's people on both sides of this, and there is the small class who have accrued, as you say, an unprecedented amount of wealth and power, and a slightly larger group of us who wish to sustain ourselves. I mean, and I think kind of keeping sight of that rather than defaulting to a kind of rise of the machines narrative is very important in actually keeping a handle on this.
And of course, you were saying there was an AI avatar there.
Very proud of my son. Who there's in the sort of atrium bit outside. They had various instantiations of a robot that's got hooked up to an LLM of some kind that allows it to answer questions put to it by the audience. And my son strode straight up and said, "Well, when are you going to take all our jobs?" And the interesting thing was that it elicited a very obviously RLHF'd paragraph of text about, no, I am here to cooperate. I am not here to take anybody's job. And it was very fluid. It had a particular tone to it. I was like, oh yeah, and someone's thought about that one, and this is the corporation speaks through you in response to that.
That's been A/B tested to hell to get that exactly right. Yeah.
I think one of the interesting things is, I've heard a lot of good arguments about how all of the focus on the creative fields has been something of a red herring for the other arenas in which AI is doing a lot more like intensive structural kinds of damage because people are less concerned about it sorting data and things like this and making, for instance, parole decisions because it's much more behind the scenes. But there's something about this understanding of quote unquote creative work, about novels, about images that people...
Because there's this sort of embattled sense of, you have to kind of keep on finding the ever tinier space where the human lurks. It's not the pineal gland. In the conversation we were having before, you mentioned logic as the quintessentially human quality once upon a time, and once that was, our capacities in that were overtaken by computers, then creativity was the sort of fallback position, and so I think that's why this particular part of the conversation has an outsize and rather obfuscatory kind of quality to it. We should probably be talking about automated targeting of missile strikes in Gaza rather than making mid-journey pictures.
Yeah, and it's also fascinating that creativity as a term didn't really become very popular until approximately the 1950s, which folks say is like a direct response to kind of this Cold War era communitarianism, right, and anti-communism, that we were invested, America specifically was very invested in this idea that we needed to find an individually located value that could be assessed and promoted, and that would help America flourish as a dominant country. So it feels all tied into this larger narrative. And those specific tests that were developed in the 50s and 60s to, quote unquote, assess creativity at the time for the workforce and for the military are now being surpassed by generative AI, and then people are using this to claim that, well, generative AI is very creative and is more creative than humans. But what these tests come down to is assessing how many different uses for a brick you can figure out, which is just, to me that's fascinating. And obviously it seems just apparent that generative AI accessing all of the data on the internet, right, all, like every human text that has been created is going to be able to come up with more ways to use a brick than one person, because it's accessing this kind of communalized knowledge. So there's this funny balance between that individualism and the communal value that AI and creativity are in this dance with right now, I think. Do we want to turn to the audience for some questions?
This is a fun bit. Yes, please.
There's a
Lovely.
roving wireless mic that will come around, but we see someone right here in the front.
Hi, thank you so much. I read a quote recently by an individual named Cristobal Valenzuela, who is the CEO of Runway. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Runway. And essentially what he said was that the age of starting AI companies is over, which you're agreeing with. And he said it's more about essentially what you can do as a media company. And Runway is essentially a media company. And so I was, and what was compelling about the quote was about the interactivity between users and the creators, which AI allows the average person to pick up their phone and see creativity as something within their reach, not just receiving creativity, like you wrote books and people read it. So I'm curious, how do you feel as creators about the consumers being able to be creative with you?
I mean, I guess that takes us back to our head scratching about creativity as a category. I mean, I think artistic activity is more widespread than you don't have to have an MFA to write a book or whatever. I mean, I think the fact that everybody can generate text and everybody can generate images is fine, but still there will be some people who will do things with those tools that are more interesting than others. So, I mean, this is a question about threat. I mean, I don't think I feel threatened in any particular way.
It's not a question about threat. It's a question about you as a creator who sits down and distills your life experience into a novel you write. The interactivity, like you might decide in 2 years that you want to write an interactive novel with your audience, and that's possible with AI.
Yeah, I mean, I think those kind of collaborations are potentially very exciting.
I saw that quote from the CEO of Runway. I thought that's very interesting that he comes up with this quote. It says, "We're not an AI company. We are a media and entertainment company." At exactly the same time when Goldman Sachs is saying that AI companies have peaked and everyone should question about how much investment. I was like, that's very interesting. I see what you did there.
Where's the $1 trillion problem that's being solved?
Yeah, it was very interesting timing. But I do think there's a deeper problem here, right? Which is that these companies act as if we were asking for creativity to be outsourced, as if they had audiences of people saying, "Oh God, please, will you just make a movie for me so that I don't have to do it?" Or "Please write a poem for me because I just don't have the time." I mean, that's not any poet I've ever met, but apparently somebody, said this to somebody at some point. So this is the whole myth, right? That they're giving us tools that we always wanted because we just didn't have time to do it ourselves. It is something very different than that. It is a set of algorithmic processes that are actually 60 years old. It was an approach looking for a solution, and it was only possible when computational power hit a certain limit. And so now it's like trying to pitch it as something that will resolve a question that I think very few people were asking. So at the moment, what we're seeing is a whole lot of AI companies try to reposition themselves as something else. And that, to me, that is the story. The interesting thing is now, what is this industry going to do now that it has become so saturated with money and investment that it's got to try and find a way to delineate what it does? So, I guess to me that, again, is taking us back to a sort of a political economic theory, but that's the thing that is super fascinating.
I mean, you see various versions of this on the net, which is, I wanted a machine to do the washing up while I wrote my poem rather than to write the poem while I had to do the washing up.
Right.
I mean,
that's a meme for a reason. Yeah.
Just if you'll allow me, like the part of the quote that I found interesting is, imagine watching something that generates itself as you watch it. And that is interesting. I mean, that's what everybody does with their phones anyway.
Right. Yeah. Love to give somebody else a chance. I think we have got a question over here and one over here in the middle. Fantastic.
Hi guys, thanks. I'm wondering what kind of stock, if any, you put in these kind of public domain initiatives. So I know Holly Herndon and Matt Dryhurst recently released a public domain 12M, which is 12.4 million data set, which is, I think, the first largest public domain data set that is big enough to train a large algorithmic model. And they've also been involved in various data trust efforts. So, I mean, Kate, you said earlier that there's like 5 companies in the world that have the wealth and the compute power to be able to really compete in this space. Are there any opportunities for alternatives, these kind of commons-oriented projects to really intervene in the space?
Thank you. It's a great question, and for people who are interested in what Julia was talking about, it is a model that Matt Herndon and Holly Herndon and Matt Dryhurst released, which is entirely public domain images. And interestingly, Adobe tried to do something similar when they trained Firefly and said, we've created a completely kind of commons-based model. But of course, it was a lot of artists whose work had fallen out of copyright who were not very happy about that. So it's interesting that this is sort of the first attempt to say this is, again, a publicly accessible model of images where you're not actually infringing copyright. There's two problems I have here. Absolutely, we need to come up with a political vision of AI that isn't totally privately owned. I think they're really trying hard, and I particularly commend Spawning, which is the group that's doing this work, to everybody if you want to go and look at alternative models. But the thing that we have to stop and talk about is, how are you going to train on that? Well, how you're going to train on it is you're going to need a ton of compute, and that is going to use an extraordinary amount of energy, and it is going to, again, use an enormous amount of water. As we know, like, these systems are now, in some cases, you know, the hyperscalers are using water, the equivalent of entire sort of towns at a time. I mean, we are looking at one of the most environmentally damaging systems that we've created as a human, and ultimately now saying, well, let's just get more people creating more models and training those. Doesn't strike me in the end as a very positive model. But just one quick thing, if I may, I'm much more interested in a much more radical approach, which would be, what does nationalization of models look like? What would it mean to say these are infrastructures that should be publicly owned from the outset? Rather than just proliferating a million of them, let's talk about having a few that are centralized and actually publicly owned.
I was just going to dive in, just add in that, I mean, people probably saw Eric Schmidt, former Googler, you know, asked about the environmental impact of generative AI, and said, well, I don't think we're going to solve it. We better our best way is to go all in on more AI, and hope that solves the climate crisis.
Right.
Which was the most nihilistic thing I've heard. I don't know, that's been running round and round my head as this kind of, you know, I don't know, it's acceleration into the pit, essentially.
Yeah. Chatbots are going to fix it for us. I mean, again, it's just so extraordinary that it's this wish fulfillment horizon, which is, let's just keep building the problem, and the solution
and we'll find a purpose for it.
Exactly, the solution will come at the end. But that really is the ideology of the moment, and we really have to look at it very hard and say, we've now created a system. Generative AI alone is about to be using as much energy as Japan. So we've basically bolted an entirely new industrial nation onto the world's energy bill, and that is already growing. So that's the conversation that we need to be having.
Thank you. Is it on?
You can maybe shout it out and we'll repeat the question.
Yeah, we can hear you. Don't worry, we'll repeat the question.
There we go. Julia kindly turned it off so we wouldn't interfere. Thank you all. I agree that discussions about creativity are to some extent a red herring, especially given what you're saying about warfare and environmental cost. But I'd like to ask a really specific question about the role of the prompt and the prompter in these collaborations, if we were going to call them that. One thing that I'm observing that I find fascinating in working alongside so-called creatives in the tech industry is the way that the prompt itself is becoming a form and a genre, and the way that people are training themselves to write better prompts. And also on the corporate level, the way that corporations are asking their workers and training them to write better prompts. Of course, this is a way of absorbing information from the workers who are employed, but I'm kind of continually returning, you know, and also in my own experiments, you know, the prompt as writing project itself is becoming a genre. And I'm wondering if you could speak to that, that feedback loop, that we train ourselves to write for the machine who's writing for us or creating for us.
I saw something earlier today, actually, which was somebody was an AI founder was angsting about Gen Z can't prompt because Gen Z doesn't have language skills to a high enough level, and therefore they need image input. They need to prompt via TikTok, via some other modality, and I don't know. Yeah, I mean that's completely fascinating to me. I mean, I love collecting examples of all genres of writing, so I screenshot prompts. Like those Mid-Journey prompts, which have got kind of 25 different kind of photo style references in them. I mean, just as a use of language, I find it interesting. But that's not really addressing your question. Maybe you will.
I love this question because I also find that feedback loop really fascinating. I mean, you might remember sort of first edition of Midjourney, and you had to say what type of lens, black and white, close focus, animal jumping through a hoop. It was this kind of absurd long lists of things that were supposed to produce the thing that you want. But it actually becomes a lot like a slot machine, right? You're like, oh, that's not it. Okay, let's go again. Oh, that's not quite it. Let's go again. And people start swapping these kind of prompt series of hundreds of words to try and get exactly what they want. Which if you stop for a minute and say, okay, this is a machine that doesn't give you what you want until you have exactly the right incantation of the right series of words, and even then you probably don't get what you want. That to me raises a really big question of who are we writing for? Who are we producing for? And in a research group that I'm in called Knowing Machines, we sort of started asking this question of, are these systems designed to produce anything you want, that you will finally get to the perfect set of words or the perfect prompt to get what you want? My proposition is that they can't. And the reason why you can see that is if you spend time with the training data. If you look at something like Lion 5B, you get the impression it's got 5 billion images. It must be a representative sample of the internet and all human creation. Not at all. In fact, and what we showed in a study recently, which was headed by the amazing Christo Buszczak, is that, in fact, they oversample from, wait for it, e-commerce sites. So the top site of images, the Lion 5B, is in fact Shopify. So when you're using these systems, you're not just generating anything that you can think of in your mind, you're seeing like a shopping cart.
It's the Temuification of everything. I mean, I really like the idea of incantation. I'm so interested in the idea of the prompt engineer as priest, as the one who has studied the High Church Latin of prompting and is able to go to the spirit and the sky and bring something back to the people. It is a picture of a cat.
And it's wearing a hat.
It is interesting though, because this kind of writing for a system, it's not new though, right? I feel like I've worked in nonprofit publishing for a decade now, and I always have this joke that like the contemporary form of the Oulipo is just grant applications. And in my last workplace, we had this amazing problem where we had published a book that had the word Russia in its title, but the automated grant evaluating system for, I believe it was New York State, wouldn't let you name any place other than somewhere in New York. And so it kept rejecting our grant report because
just write Brighton Beach.
But then there were also word limits, so we couldn't describe the novel every time. And so then we just were tying ourselves in knots trying to figure out how to correctly answer this system that had been built. And so I think, it's obviously a much escalated version of that, but there's so many ways in which we're crafting unique forms that are, I think there's a beautiful way in which prompting is like a new genre of poetry almost, but you're having a dialogue with this absurd system and trying to, there's often these kind of slot reactions to written work.
I love this, Rachel, because I think we can say now that what this panel has resolved is that if you want an image of the future of the creative industries, just think of people using ChatGPT to produce grant applications and then someone sitting at a desk using ChatGPT to assess grant applications.
I think we have time for one last question from the audience, if there is one. I see a couple back here.
I was wondering, as AI becomes more customizable, right? This is again the notion that maybe someday you can get what you want out of it. But I was wondering if there was any hope that you see for AI models that are customizable enough to be their own copyrightable content. So, let's say you could make a character in a video game that is AI powered but has its own sort of corpus of data and that it's pulling from, and increasingly customizable sort of agent models. What do you see about AI itself becoming intellectual property and specific
isn't the trouble with that you're always downstream of these frontier models that are you're still in some way dependent on these structures that need this huge scale to function, and I mean, I've listened to conversations where people are saying, I've got this instance of whatever model it is, and I've been talking to it for a year now, and I feel it's, people are beginning to ascribe various kind of human qualities to it or whatever, or feeling that their work on configuring this instance of a particular model is worthy of recognition in some way. And and clearly Labour has gone into getting the model to that state, but it is still an instance of a model that you haven't originated in some way.
I mean, you just asked the question that I'm pretty sure Disney Corp is asking right now, which is how can we use these giant models and fine-tune them with our characters and still own everything we produce? So what you've just articulated, I think, is probably where it's going to go, because I don't think that we're going to live in this moment of radical proliferation of unowned content for very long. And what you'll see is companies saying, we have to own this, we have to use these tools, we have to own the outputs. How can we say that our fine-tuning that we've plonked on top of the frontier model actually means that we own the outputs? But that's, again, I would have questions here about whether copyright is our friend to really answer the core questions about what's going on here.
To wrap things up, maybe if we're about to see this complete overhaul of copyright law potentially in the United States, do you have any positive dreams for that experience? Or is it going to be is there anything we could see out of that seems like it will be notable?
That's definitely one for you.
Yeah. Sorry, Kate, I put you on the spot.
No, I mean, I think it's extremely interesting. I mean, we are living in a moment that hasn't happened for hundreds of years, where we can say, is there another way to think about relationship of labor to production and what we make in the world that doesn't have to go through the same very kind of tired models of intellectual property? Is there some mode of thinking about communal ownership, communal production that actually acknowledges the work of so many that have been written out for so long? That is the piece that would excite me. Again, is it utopian? Absolutely. But is it, to me, a more exciting utopia than yet another model for producing kind of cat images? Yeah, it is.
Well, I feel like we could go on forever, but there is another panel coming up. So thank you so much, Hari. Thank you so much, Kate. It's been just such a treat to have you.
Rachel.
And